Welcome back. Now, Joel is going to tell us everything we need to know to pretend we're British. That's what we're doing, right, Joel?
I'm not sure I can. Something like that. I'm not quite sure I can claim you're going to get everything you need to know to be British here.
You can do that in 15 minutes. It can't be that hard. You're British. Seems easy enough. I know.
Yeah. It's
Teasing.
trickier than being American. That's all I'll say. So there we go. So as I like to do on these occasions, I try and have a look at some various aspects of British culture. Specifically, trying to have a look at matters as it ties into our time period, because there's all sorts of interesting things. And I look what I could find and information-wise, and I'm going to talk a little about sport at the time, because to be honest, we're at a interesting point in development in a lot of what we consider um, the the modern sport develops pretty much in the late 1800s, and a lot of the sports are in interesting points. So I'm going to discuss that. Mostly, I'm going to talk about British sports. I'll apologise to any Australians in the audience. And I know that me, as an English person, talking about that may rile up Australians a little.
As long as you don't mention Tony Wilkinson, we'll be fine.
I'm probably not going to cover that, and we're way before the Bodyline series, so that's also fine.
Excellent.
So, well, obviously 1879 gives you an eye to date. At that point in time, we are seeing the, as I say, the development of a lot of modern sports. I will go and cover those, and I will mention a couple of other bits of sport that I have put in place already. I think partially while thinking about this, I'm not going to say it's completely universal, but as geeks and nerds, role players are often seem to be drawn from the sections of particularly schools where we're not tending to be the ones who are sporty, and I think sometimes we can be a little dismissive of sport. I know full well that given this last weekend with the Super Bowl, and anytime any other major sporting event happens, many of my friends will post various silly memes talking about the sports ball and things like that. And so there is certainly a level of going considering sports silly and frivolous because it's not the thing we did because we got into gaming, and I think that quite often underplays the cultural importance of it, and particularly in anything modern world. I can think of only a couple of games that have really done a good job of covering the sports. Shadowrun being actually one of them, which definitely did it from an American view. So the first things I will look at, football. Football is a strange term because mostly, certainly over here, the other running gag that turns up in the foot around this time of year is having the Super Bowl. Certainly, American football gets a lot of things, and the discussion of they don't kick it, and that's an erroneous assumption. Football is games played with a ball on foot, as opposed to polo, and to another degree, as opposed to the more stick and ball games. But I'll get to cricket in a bit. So football has been around in some form for an awful long time, up until the beginning of the 1800s. looking at, there was a ball, two opposing teams of indeterminate size from opposing villages trying to get the ball back to their goal line. We are talking something more akin to capture the flag. In the 1800s, particularly around the British public schools, quick aside, when the British say public schools, we mean a school you have to pay for. So you might call them private schools, and that's the term used in America, which might be more accurate, but for some reason, our big paid for fee paying schools, Eton and such like, the ones everyone's heard of, are called public schools. But that's just a weird Britishism, which, yeah, this is also a good point to illustrate, because one of those schools is going to get quite important in there. And around the early 1800s, the various schools started formulating different rules for games. One of the reasons games of football are played in two halves is that quite often, if Eton and Harrow, to pull two public schools out at random, were playing each other at football, they would play one half under Eton's rules and one half under Harrow's rules, so it would be fair. By all accounts, a fairly common feature of this was you couldn't progress forward while carrying the ball and had to kick it. This obviously falls into the direction that, as Andy says, soccer gets played in, or to use its proper name, association football. Weirdly, we used to call it soccer in the UK sometimes when I was a kid, but I think rivalry with Americans and Americans insisting on calling it soccer annoyed us enough that it's dropped out of use within my lifetime, it seems. Oddly enough, I will admit association football is going to be the one I talk about least, because it's the one that interests me least. But essentially, well, as said, we have the public schools and their various competing ways of playing it. Eton had two. It had the Eton wall game, which involves groups of people with a ball, and you had to stay in contact with a wall and move it along to either end to score a goal. And they had the Eton field game, which was something akin to rugby. And then we get to rugby, which I think is probably of this. So rugby is named for rugby school, where the game was supposedly invented. As the official history goes, and I'll tell the versions that normally gets told around in schools, is they were playing football at rugby school, and a young pupil, a bit of a wag called William Webb Ellis, picked up the ball and ran with it. Because apparently it wasn't specifically denied in the rules. And got over the goal line, put the ball down, and was informed by his games master that, nice try, Webb Ellis, let's take it back. That story is completely apocryphal. For a start, they weren't playing football. They weren't playing soccer, which is the usual version of it, because the game didn't exist at the time. They were playing their variation of rugby, and the rules said that if you were holding the ball, you couldn't progress forward. So the actual thing he did was move with the ball. And supposedly the rest of rugby school liked this so much, they made it their official rules, and thus we have rugby football, which has passing backwards, it has kicking forwards, it has running, and a whole bunch of other things. And if the ball goes dead, for many reasons, you have some form of lineup between some of the players, and the ball is re-entered into play. The most common of these being a scrum. The most important of these being a scrum. It's changed a lot in recent years because of safety. We'll come back to that in a moment. There has been historical research into this. The William Webb Ellis story basically never happened. However, rugby as a sport decided they liked the story so much they would make it the official history. So the World Cup for rugby is the William Ellis Trophy, commemorating an actual real person for his utterly fictional deeds in creating the sport. Rugby, I will use the phrase rugby union at this point because that was the major code and the code I've played, developed as a sport from that point. Pretty much from the 1830s onwards. By the 1860s, we had the first foreign club playing the game, the Montevideo Cricket Club. Cricket essentially being the one sport that was in a more recognisable form, but I will get back to that. And particularly from the 1860s onwards, we see a lot of developments. 1863 is the Football Association and the development of soccer, and they get into the idea of not hitting each other and not holding the ball in your hands and kicking the ball like a bunch of namby-pamby softies. But in the 60s, we also just start to see local rugby clubs forming, games being played. In the 1870s, we get the formation of the Rugby Football Union, hence why we call it Rugby Union. And people who set down the laws of the game and make sure everyone's playing by the same rules. In about 1876, apparently, the story of William Webb Ellis starts to circulate. So it's very, very current to the setting of 1879. We also begin to see the first international games playing, specifically between England and Scotland, the old rivalry, which we've just had the 250 or the 150th anniversary of a couple of years ago. In 1877, the number of players on each side on the pitch at any one time from 20 down to 15. And in 1880, we see the beginning and the first use of the scrummage as a way of returning the ball to play, which is pretty much where we're at in world. So the other developments of that are different, and I'll have a quick obviously in 1879 we are playing with an alternate reality. This is not history as we know it. History has diverged, and I find lots of alternate history very, very interesting, but I like the subtleties and the oddities and work out from there how other things change. So 1880, the year we're looking at, they introduced the scrummage, which is essentially the biggest 8 people on each side have a ginormous group hug. One of the smaller guys throws a ball into it, and 2 of the people are allowed to try and hack at the ball and kick it and knock it back so it goes to their side. This is, until relatively recent changes to the safety code, a ginormous and terrible way for people to get incredibly nasty, life-altering injuries because you can break your neck in this. Even when I was playing it in the 90s, where they had tried to reduce some of the danger of that, a bunch of people basically forming 2 mobs up and putting their heads together and pushing into each other. If you imagine sort of bringing your hands together and knitting your fingers together, but do that with rugby players, not your fingers, you're getting somewhere close to it. I know when I played, I was not a clean player. I was a dirty player. I used to headbutt other people in the scrum because the ref couldn't see what my head was doing because I was one of the people in the middle of it. and I would attempt to distract the opposition every way I could. I heard people threatening other players that if they do anything they don't like, they're going to bite their ear off. Um, it's a rough part of the sport, and it has changed, and in my lifetime, been reduced down to the amount of pushing because you seriously did that serious thing. You're talking a professional rugby scrum these days is getting on for 1,000 kilos. That's 2,000 kilograms. That to be freedom units of humanity in very close contact, pushing with all of their might. The potential for dangers is ludicrous and messy. Um, and these days, scrums happen, but they're not heavily contested to the same degree as they were, um, for safety's sake. Yeah, I was brought forward for all of my playing career in the mid 90s, so I'm just a big thug, really. Um, Interestingly, on the point of divergences from this code and modern scrums in modern rugby union not being particularly contested, the US college football, which is a variant of rugby, started introducing a form of scrummage called the line of scrimmage, where the ball was lined up and it wasn't contested at all, which means in 1880 we've got the beginnings of what I would call, sport historians seem to call the gridiron codes, American football and Canadian football beginning, and they begin with taking the idea of the scrum as a restart, making it actually much safer and much less contested. And it is, which is a series of rugby set pieces. The forward pass not coming into the game for a long, long time at this point. But yeah, by the 1880s, we are looking at competitions between national sides happening. Um, and this is all stuff that is happening at the time of our game. And I suppose, yeah, try to draw a conclusion to the rugby portion of this talk. Rugby is a game where even now you have people who are a couple of £100 of solid muscle, looking not too unlike a troll, uh, playing on the same field at the same time as 5'7", £100 speedsters. American football, particularly, is notable, and you see such specialization in positions. You get huge amounts of variations in the size of the players, and they're all playing the same game on the same pitch. Um, I've seen pictures of people looking like battle tanks and a skinny guy in glasses who just happened to be the kicker. And with the arrival of Boojums in 1879, we're going to see quite clearly the trolls are going to become the props. Though the horns and scrummaging is going to make life interesting. And snarks, and even dwarves playing the big, solid, I'm in a strong positions, and humans and elves specializing in becoming the backs, the quick players, the equivalent to receivers, because it is a game that values specialization. And of course, there's going to be those people who are going to go, no, all allowed play this, they have an unfair advantage. Sport is always home to racism and controversy. The 1960s, 70s in sports and South Africa, for example, which is a whole kettle of fish that I'm going to touch Yes, quite probably. Trolls on the Wing. Ooh, particularly big Samoan trolls. Um, I've briefly lost my train of thought. Bear with me a second. But yeah, sport is politics and culture tied together, and it will always be part of it. Yes, and the other thing I would say is this is sort of running into the future. Is rugby in the 1890s has a huge controversy and change to the game in that this time period sports are amateur affairs. And rugby particularly got a very serious into the idea of being an amateur competition. And in the 1890s, some of the northern clubs, the more working class areas of the country, there were charges leveled against them about professionalism, paying people because they're going to play games because you couldn't play on a Sunday when the factories are closed because that's a day of worship and a day of rest. But equally, if you were a working class guy in a mill, you couldn't afford to miss a day of work, even if you were a wonderful rugby player. So there were people getting paid compensation to play rugby instead of working. This led to a huge mess, and essentially most of the northern working class teams broke away and formed the Rugby League, which is became a professional code. It's a very different game. They have much less contested scrums because if you're going to get paid for it, you don't want to break your neck. Even up until could it be the mid 90s, I think. Let's scroll down my historical document. Rugby union remained a resolutely amateur game, even at the top international levels. You didn't get paid for playing rugby. The fact that it was tied into the British system quite heavily, and if you were good at a team, they would sort you out a job that would go, oh yeah, you can have 4 days off a week to go and train for rugby because we think that's important. It brings prestige to our company. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have gone to a rugby playing school. One of the great great rugby players, a gentleman called Brian Moore, um, who looks like he's lost a fight against the entire pub. Very intelligent man. He was a, he was a barrister. He was a barrister, and a very well recognised one, and a very good rugby player. Played hooker for England. Yes, we know the jokes. Which is the person who kicks the ball back in the scrum. And he was, but his official payment was as a barrister. Pretty much all his playing life, and he now makes his money commentating on rugby. And he's a decent guy, and he was an old boy at my school, which is something that I've always enjoyed. That as a aside of politics and sports, it's a thing. It's a way to bring them into the game, and I'm going to try and sort of tie into how to do that. And rugby is likely something players and characters can do for fun. It's a great excuse for your character to have a lot of skill in unarmed combat. I'd say that much. I'll cover a little bit of the sports events, but as my final statement on rugby is an interesting fact is that obviously I've already mentioned American football, Canadian football, breakaway codes of that develop from rugby, and there's certainly other codes out there. Most notably, Australian football, which other than it always seeming completely crazy and
Look, let's not even get into
insane.
Australian football. It's just a
Yeah,
football.
yeah, I don't know a lot about it. However, the person who actually invented Australian football was a gentleman called Tom Wills, who was actually a student at rugby school
And then he
who
was
played
deported.
rugby. What's that?
Then he was transported.
I don't know if he was transported, but he ended up in Melbourne in 1858 and essentially developed the Australian code of rugby football.
Which in its early days was running around a 2-mile long field. And it literally took all that to play against for a single goal and the first team to score one.
Yeah, that is essentially the origins of. That's what most football games looked like before the 1800s. It's the nature. It's effectively almost a game of capture the flag. But I find it mildly entertaining that the gentleman who developed the Australian rules football, we have proof he developed the rules, and he was an old student at rugby school, just to be different. So yeah, as football, association football, I will cover it a little bit at this point. It, as I said, it breaks away from rugby in the 1860s, and in the 1870s, we are seeing the development of, through the Football Association, the FA. We're seeing professional players, we're seeing kicking the ball, and we're seeing the beginnings of club football as we know it. An awful lot of British clubs are hitting that point. The older ones are hitting their 150th anniversaries over the next decade or so. And it mostly becomes, I think, in part because it's non-contact, so you're probably not going to get heavily injured doing it. It's fairly simple to play. You can, jump us for goalposts. You just need a ball. That poor pig. It's an easy game to play, which is one of the reasons it's become the mass game of the world. And I'm just going to sort of say, point Sheffield Wednesday, the team I support, if I pay any attention to it, and they're terrible these days. I think I find it strange to some degree that apart from in the US, the globally dominating sports, basketball does very well in places. But the biggest sport in the world is football. Cricket's huge, particularly in old Commonwealth countries. Rugby's all over the place. All of these sports were developed basically, and I think spread by the British Empire, and it's an interesting sociological question as to it's not like the French and the Prussians, the Germans, are all the Dutch didn't have empires. How come their ball games? They're playing the British ball games. Which is a sociological mystery for the ages, I think. So, yes, Great Britain, great at inventing sports and then getting beaten at them by the rest of the world. It is true. I think particularly something about the culture of Victorian Britain, which is all the time period of this, it helps that we ruled half the world and could channel all of their resources to us and steal all the credit for everything we invented, which I suspect is probably part of it. But equally, it always comes across, if you read the histories, as a empire, a society that celebrates its greatness on their one class. I'm not saying it to strict imagination. So I think it was a hotbed for innovation in its way, and seems to be. And I would say the 1879 version of it in our game is more progressive, is more open to the idea of more people from different places having good ideas. So sports will develop very, very differently. Well, John, the Ada Lovelace point. Nobody gave a lot of a damn about Ada Lovelace until we rediscovered how much work she'd done. Because it's almost she was a person who was Byron's daughter. That was what was important about her. The whole brilliant mathematician and the inventor of computer programming is almost something. It's definitely something she did, but it's almost something that's been rediscovered much later and properly recognized than it was. Because the same is true of Babbage's work. It didn't really go anywhere. It was clever and it was interesting, but it was a curio. And then we've come back and worked out ways to get that work and similar things to work. People have gone back in the history and looked at it and found out these early innovators and gone, oh yeah, they're building on the same principles we are. But then it's not sport. I said I'm not going to say a lot more on the football codes, other than a suspicion that I think, technically speaking, basketball counts as a football code because it's played on foot with a ball, and has rules unique to it about how you progress it up and down the field, and a very small net. I'm going to move on to cricket at this point because I have had a lifelong relationship with the game of cricket, at least potentially apocryphal. Family anecdotes of the day I was brought out of hospital. I was pretty much taken straight to I was pretty much taken straight to a cricket game, given I'm born in May, which means it's in the cricket season, and I was born midweek. A few days in hospital would lead to a Saturday being the day that I was brought home, and the idea of my father missing a cricket game that he was supposed to be playing in for such a trivial matter as his second son coming out of hospital is remarkably plausible. But it may just be it seems as good as. I've never been a great player of cricket. However, up until the point where I was old enough to be left at home on my own and go out to town and hang out with my friends and role play with them mostly, in my mid-teens, on a Saturday in the summer, I went to a cricket game from probably the age, from being a baby to being about 14. If it was Saturday, I was at a cricket game. The home games, well, depending where we were living at the time, we moved around a lot. My dad played for quite a lot of cricket teams. And cricket is a game that takes all day. Cricket, at the point we are at in there, is 100%, unlike even rugby union, which is just becoming something recognisable, is 100% recognisable as the cricket people know now and play. There's a couple of odd differences. Cricket is a complicated game. The batsmen go out onto the field, the opposition field. There are two ends. The game is divided up into units called overs. An over is a certain number of balls bowled by a single bowler. In the 1870s, we are looking at the point where the idea of the bowler rolling the ball along the floor to the batsman in the manner of bowls has been replaced, and thank you. Yes, we'll get in a moment. Has been replaced by underarm bowling, and is around this point the idea of overarm bowling is just starting to come in. I suspect this overarm bowling, I know enough to understand, deeply changes what you can do. You can get yourself the ball going a lot quicker. You can do interesting, clever things with it. A cricket ball is a sphere, but it has, in the mist, holding it all together, it has a seam which is slightly raised. The different sides of it can wear differently, and if you know the pitch well, you can bounce it off different bits to make the ball quicker. Given overarm bowling is a newfangled thing at the point we're dealing with 1879, unfortunately, this probably means we can't use the phrase "he bowled me a googly," because the phrase doesn't exist yet. I believe that's actually relatively modern, unfortunately. A googly being a ball that essentially swings one way, then swings the other in midair, to really confuse the batsman and possibly hit him in the googlies. I may invent it sooner. Yes, yeah. As said, we're playing with an alternate history. Things are different. And as Manny said, cricket is a game that is played all day. The cricket game divides into, it's essentially always the same set of rules, but you play test matches, which go on for 5 days. You have limited overs matches, which are either 50 overs each, or abominations, or some sort of abominations of 20 overs or even 10 overs each. One of the interesting points is an over these days is 6 balls. One bowler bowls to a batsman from one end of the wicket, which is I believe 22 yards long stretch, ending with a set of stumps at each end, which are 3 upright sticks and two smaller sticks balanced on top. The idea being, if you can hit the stumps, you may. The batsman is out. It's one of a number of ways he can be out. He can be bowled out by hitting the stumps. He can be hit which is the only thing stopping the ball hitting the stumps is his leg rather than the bat, or he can be caught out, which is the ball is in the air and is caught before it hits the ground and runs, just like a catch in baseball. So there's that. At the end of the over, you score by hitting the ball and then running between the two ends of the wicket. The number of times you complete that is the number of runs you get. There are always 2 batsmen, so that if you only get an odd number of runs, the batsman who's receiving the ball swaps. There's a whole range of tactics and timing based on things and all sorts of considerations to take advantage of who is on strike and do that. If you're a very good batsman, you probably want to keep him on strike, so you always want to score even numbers of runs and then an odd number of runs so that he can face the other bowler at the other end. Over 6 balls, though I hadn't realised how modern that was. The weird Australians used to bowl up until the late 70s, were doing 8 balls and over. I'm not sure on that. It's quite possible. It is quite possible the batsman had to run to both ends of the wicket to score a single run. And I suspect the whole having 2 batsmen is kind of the new thing. Yes, over time. Quite a lot. In the 1800s, overs were 4 balls, so a lot shorter. But apparently, the actual rules for cricket didn't specify it until 1979, where it specified 6 balls. Just at the start of the game, both captains agree how many balls are in an over. If they wanted to be 32 balls in an over, they technically could do that. It would take forever. Cricket was played, it's essentially played in 2 innings. Each team takes its innings to bat, and bat to see how many runs they can get before they are all out. The other team that bats second then attempts to beat that score without being all out. Nice and simple, takes all day, have regular breaks for tea, for tea and cakes, which I think is probably where I'm getting on there. It is a genteel way to while away a weekend afternoon for professionals and decent people of standing. Everybody else in the village, and probably the nearby village who's playing them, will come down to enjoy the spectacle, sit around the edge of the pitch, having picnics, maybe drinking champagne if you're that sort of way out. It's a pleasant way to spend a nice summer day. It is the equivalent to baseball in America, and has that whole, it's something you go and do. At least part of it is about the experience, eating your hot dogs, or your cucumber sandwiches in the case of cricket, your meat pies if you're Australian. Beer is kind of essential, and then there's a couple of breaks for drinks. There's a proper break between the 2 innings where everyone has tea, and somebody's wife has to organise it. And it's a cricket. You have sandwiches, some cakes, and a cup of tea, and then you go out and play the second half again, and then you all go to the nearest bar and you drink. The point is, this is a big social occasion. If you're running a game and you want to do something with getting people to a big social occasion, means people get together. I'm pretty sure there's at least one murder mystery out there that has been done where somebody dies in a cricket match. I'd be surprised if there's not more. I don't think there's a Holmes on it. A Holmes episode of cricket, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It's another position. Yeah, it's another way of having social interactions and intrigues. There's some seriously high society people involved in this. One of the great Sherlock Holmes is the character we reference a lot, and yeah, I'm kind of personally going no ho, I probably wouldn't make Sherlock Holmes real in the 1879 universe because he comes with way too much baggage. But the idea of Holmes and the idea of consulting detectives, because among other things, if Holmes exists, no play character detectives allowed to compete, really. So, you could become the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. That's a good thing. One of the other great Victorian literary figures was created by a cousin of Arthur Conan Doyle, who went, well, if Holmes is this brilliant good guy, I'm going to create the brilliant bad guy. And he creates a character called Raffles, who is the archetypal gentleman thief. He's a thief. He's got a manservant. They have a weirdly homoerotic relationship. More blatant, really, than the Holmes and Watson's implication. And people have been writing Holmes and Watson / fiction since the 1800s. Yeah, since they released the books, it's always been a thing, so it's not new. But Raffles he's a gentleman, and he mostly steals from people, who aren't very nice. He's not particularly nice himself, but his actual professional life thing he did in our country was as a professional cricket player. So taking that idea, it's a good excuse for someone to go around, be in a lot of places, and break into people's houses and steal all their jewels. It's just one aspect. Indeed, yeah, the term slash fiction is much more modern, and I'm lucky enough to know some of the. Well, I know children of the people who invented slash fiction. British science fiction fandom over here, or involved, certainly the British wing of it. But as I said, a cricket match, particularly over any other sport that you can logically have, is such a big social occasion that it's a great place to put in intrigue and strangeness and use in a game. And I think it's a shame not to use it. Equally, cricket is a weird and arcane sport, and I've said this at these talks before. And my usual thing is, cricket is full of strange terms. You are defending the stumps, which are a sort of stylized gate with sort of similarities to a small portion of Stonehenge, from being struck by your enemy and knocked down. It's got so much potential for weird ritual that it just says magic. It says weird things. In the I believe 1880s, maybe 90s, 1890s, Matthew may correct me and give me the exact date on this one. You have an Australian touring side comes to Britain and beats England at the home of cricket, Lord's Cricket Ground. Come on. It's a sport where they call the main ground Lord's. It's definitely doing something, right? And this so upset British cricket fans that they took the stumps and they burnt them and they kept ashes. And now that is, for well over 100 years, there has been a regular series of matches between Australia and England where we exchanged the little urn that the ashes commemorating the death of English cricket because we got beaten by some upstart Australians. If that's just mysticism and weirdness as it is. Cricket is full of this, and it's perfect for it. Also, I'm going to share a picture into the chat, which is a glorious map I found recently on the completely wrong Facebook group, Terrible Maps, which gives you gives you all the names used for the fielding positions. Note, cricket teams are only 11 people. You are never having someone standing at all of these points. You move the field out depending on who's batting and who's bowling and where you think to do it. But I'd like to particularly bring your attention to the two positions, silly mid-off and silly mid-on, which are positioned halfway down the wicket, in the position where essentially the bowler comes in and bowls. If the batsman hits a good strong strike, the place he's going to hit it, that's going to put it coming off his bat at its quickest, most dangerous way, means the ball is going through your head. Yeah, hence the moniker silly, because it's a stupid place to stand. And you have the slips, and the very mysterious and sinister sounding gully. And all sorts of other bits. I'm going to say that's going to be where I can draw close in cricket. And I hate to say it, my often mentioned British Source book is probably going to have an entire chapter on cricket and sports because it is such an important part of British culture. And it may just be about how cricket is a giant ritual that's summoning alien demons to destroy our world. I just don't know yet. But I'll work that one out. I will say also in the 1870s we have the rise of the well-known Society, which is a group of British people in the wonderfully titled town of Much Wenlock, rather than Lesser Wenlock, which we don't talk about, who started holding games in the manner of the ancient Greeks to test people's athletic abilities. and do that. And it was a spectacle that the Baron de Coubertin came and saw and was so impressed that he started the International Olympic Committee in 1894 at the Olympic Games. Again, it's just a weird British innovations and people doing strange things. Look, anyone wants to badmouth British cooking, I will meet you at Gen Con. I will fight you over this. British cooking is excellent when it's very good. And it's better than American cooking, for the most part. Because, we have better ingredients. But that's a different matter. And that might be next year's talk. I may just do a Victorian meal. How to cook a Victorian meal next. I've probably just committed to that, because Andy's not going to let me get away with not doing that now.
I'm not.
Well, doing a cooking class at next year's Freedoniacon, I could do it.
Okay.
I could find Victorian recipes. But, we may go that.
Okay.
Though then again,
You're on.
nobody else can taste it.
But yeah, I guess
I
that
will
won't prove
finish-
anything. You're gonna have to come to the U.S., like over to my
Yeah.
house, and make me dinner, and then I will taste test it and tell them if it's good. Fair and accurate.
That sounds excellent. We'll work something out. I do historical cookeries in my other hobbies, but not much earlier than Victorian, to be honest. So I'm going to finish up with talking about one of the little bits that I've snuck in that, as I've said, sports is important in most cultures, I think, but the British culture, it seems particularly. So, given we are in the development of rugby, I've put something in, mostly to amuse myself, into the Fort Ellis source book. In the first bit, they let me write, and they didn't stop me writing it. I'd been reading about the Zulu. I got to write the Zulus. The Zulus are an interesting lot. But one of the things I noted is that, essentially speaking, from the point that they can walk, young Zulu boys are given short clubs and encouraged to pick fights with each other so they get better. So essentially, your way of passing being bored as a Zulu is drinking and hitting people with sticks. And the British military, which were a big pushing force in a lot of this development of rugby clubs at this time, idea of having a good time is having a bit of argy-bargy, possibly with the ball involved, and then drinking. And over this commonality, in our timeline, a group of Zulu force British troops at the Battle of Islandwana, which I probably mispronounced. So the British Zulu Wars, as they were in real history, don't really happen. But a group of Zulu rebels try and kill all the British, and other Zulus save them. And while obviously the officers and nobles, the best terms I can use quickly, are having some drinks and congratulating each other on their new alliance, you have a whole bunch of common troops sitting around. And their thought turns to beer, and they discover commonality. And thus the British and the Zulus start getting on, which sort of gets us to Zulus having colony villages in the groves. And, well, they start looking for a game they can all play, and somebody takes the game of rugby and takes these sticks the Zulus like to hit each other with and combines the two. I will completely raise my hands up here. The rules I've written up, or as described, is not really based on rugby or anything else, other than it's based on Jugger, from the series of 80s future sport, death sport films. Rise of the Jugger and all of that. Pretty much as played within LARPing and SCA communities the world over, as far as I can work out. Because I actually know the rules to that one. You move a ball, some people are allowed to carry the ball, some people have sticks, some people have shield. It's a very rough game. I call it the stick and ball game because I'm also fond of sneaking in smutty gags once in a while. And Brad hasn't told me off for it yet. And I've just developed it. It just seemed to make a lot of sense. I figure the Swords probably like it, particularly the plain Swords, because they like fighting people. It becomes a thing, and it's yeah. I completely took the rules from a piece of fiction and put it in as a reference. But it's also there to go. Sport is important, and yeah, but my sly British wit is not British wit is not particularly subtle at any point. I almost had the right to say "wink, wink" in the text. I came fairly close. And in my experience, Brad is a cunning and subtle man himself. Mostly, what's the word? It is just a matter of me going, what what do a bunch of working class people do when they're bored? They find a game to play. At some point I might throw in board games. I ponder about role playing games. I'm running an adventure at the moment where the characters are in the middle of a scavenger hunt. There is more to game worlds, and then where are the monsters? Where is the treasure? And I think I consider my duty as a games designer, as a writer, to remember that and address it and write about it. And I hope that's been a reasonable talk and it's made some amount of sense. I know I just ran about a particular subject, but it is what I do. And I hope that has been of interest to people and maybe spark some other ideas, because particularly when we're playing with an alternate universe, we've got a lot of real world culture we can base things on, and we can go from there. And at some point, I might get around to designing the stick. The stick and ball game is as 1879's answer to Blood Bowl, would be workable as a board game, I think. But yes, rugby as a replacement for tribal warfare. I suspect on a lot of these ball games, the original origin was there were conflicts between villages and they needed a way to settle it. Sport is a solid replacement for war, which is pretty much the subject of about half the science fiction films that deal with sport. And I would say I've got 2 minutes left, and I will wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening. And, well, I'll still be around for the rest of the con. Thank you, and good night for that.
Okay. And with that, 3, 2, 1, I'm stopping.